Hello. Well, good afternoon. It's definitely a pleasure to be here with you. I missed my first cabinet meeting after the elections on last Sunday, but I'll forgive Juan and Ana who invited me. No, I'm very happy to be here. They asked me to talk about deregulation in 15 minutes, so I'll do my best. I'll give you a little bit of background about Milei's government. I'm going to start with that. I would say we have four main themes in this government. The first one is fiscal austerity, the idea that Argentina has to have a fiscal surplus, that most of the problems of Argentina have been the result of pervasive and persistent fiscal deficits. A very strong respect for property rights as a second idea. Economic freedom, which is the deregulation agenda, as a third idea. And then, of course, the president has an agenda on security and international relations, which is a strong alignment with the US, with Europe, and with Israel. So I'm gonna focus on the fiscal adjustment and on the deregulation because I think it's quite interesting. As you can see in this slide, we inherited a fiscal deficit of around 5% of GDP, and we achieved a fiscal surplus in 1 month. A reduction of government expenditure of 30%. The president has kept a fiscal surplus throughout the last 2 years. Now Argentina is one of the 5 countries in the world which has a fiscal surplus. And the president is totally committed to this objective. And I think the idea that the way that Milei implemented this fiscal adjustment challenges our view on fiscal policy on, I would say, 3 different grounds. The first one is how fast and how much you can do. Because when we came to the government, people said, well, maybe you can do 1% per year, and then over 4 years you can adjust it. And he said, no, 1% per year, no. We're going to do 5% in 1 month. And for that, you need to think a little bit out of the box, touch things that maybe you thought were untouchable, but then when you touch it, nothing happens, okay? So I think that is how much and how fast is kind of perhaps one provocation and one thing that he forces us to think about. The second is that there's, I would say, like a common wisdom that if you do a fiscal adjustment, you're going to have to pay an output cost. And with the president, we didn't think that was true at all, because when every penny, every dollar, every peso that the government spends is a penny or a dollar or a peso that the taxpayer has to pay. So when you reduce government expenditure, you're actually reducing the amount of taxes that people pay. So why should that be recessionary? Yes, the government is going to spend less, but then people are going to spend more. In fact, in the first year, the year in which Javier Milei did this adjustment of 5% of GDP in fiscal and government expenditures, the output expanded by 6%. By the way, I have to say that several Italian economists, Alberto Alesina, Francesco Giavazzi, who had studied fiscal adjustments in Europe, had already found that fiscal adjustments which are implemented through a reduction of government expenditure are expansionary. So I think we have to be careful with the argument, don't do a fiscal adjustment because you're going to pay an output cost. If the fiscal adjustment is done through a reduction of government expenditure, it's most likely to be expansionary. And the third, which I think is the most interesting, is that people say don't do a fiscal adjustment because you're going to become unpopular. And we say, how can you become unpopular if you're reducing taxes on people? Actually, fiscal adjustment is the most popular thing that you can do because fiscal adjustment, maybe it's unpopular for the politicians, which got the money from the people and were deciding how to spend people's money. But giving back that money to people, that certainly is very popular. In the case of Argentina, this 5% reduction in government expenditure implied, for example, that we eliminated the inflation tax because we eliminated the deficit, we eliminated the money printing, which was financing the deficit, and that allowed us to move 12 million people above the poverty line in just 1.5 years. So again, kind of another thing that I want to share with you is fiscal adjustment, maybe the most popular thing that you can think out. So I think that's kind of interesting. Let me move to the second point, which is deregulation or economic freedom. When we were discussing the name of the ministry with President Milei, he said, well, maybe we can think about a ministry of modernization. And I said, no, Javier, because the state never modernizes. The state pushes us backwards, so it would be a backwardation ministry. So we can't use that name. And then we came up with the name of deregulation which, as Anna said earlier today, is not simplification. Because the president says, never, he told me, never think of simplifying a process without asking yourself first if that process should exist or not. Okay, so go to the deeper question, ask yourself if this thing needs to be there or not, and then you can start doing your work. And perhaps one thing that I want to mention is that when you do deregulation, actually deregulation is very beneficial for all companies or for all business, for all activity, economic activity, but it's particularly beneficial for small firms, because you should think of regulation as a fixed cost. And maybe for Banco Santander, it's not such a big problem to have the regulation. They actually can deal with 100 Quijotes, okay? But for a small, imagine for a small firm which is trying to set up the business, and they say they throw the 100 Quijotes on the table and say, now you have to deal with this, okay? It's absolutely impossible. And also deregulation is the most anti-corruption policy that I can think of, because each regulation is an opportunity for corruption, okay? Now, what I want to share with you is I want you to think with me, what is the reason for regulation? And you may think that regulation is the result of a central and benevolent central planner thinking how to do good to society. Well, I think nothing further from the truth. I think regulation is most of the time the result of interest of the bureaucracy or the result of interest of economic power that use the state to build a regulation which protects interests. So I think the baseline is not to think that regulation is good. I think the baseline should be to think that regulation is bad, or at least, I mean, I come from Argentina, and Argentina is pretty much messed up than Europe and everything, so I don't know how much this extrapolates. But I want to challenge your intuition on this with one example, which is that dramatic difference that we find in our belief on the need for civil liberties and the belief that we have for economic liberties. So let's think of one contract which is very fundamental for people over their lives, which is marriage, okay? It's an important contract, okay? You signed during your life. So because we believe in civil liberties, we tend to think that the state has no say in telling us who we should marry. The age of the people we should marry, being of age, correct? The sex of the people we should marry, the wealth of the people that should marry, the character of the people that we should marry, that is an individual decision. So now let me propose to you an alternative definition for the marriage market. So in this definition, alternative setup, there's going to be a registry of potential brides and grooms, okay? So you have to register in a list, oh, I want to get married, oh, I want to get married. Then, because this is such a fundamental contract that you can't let people to decide on this on their own, it's kind of too dangerous to let them do that, the government is going to create an agency to generate matches. And there's going to be a government agent which kind of does the matching between the people. And if this matching agent paid by the government, or you have to pay to this guy, achieves a match, then you have to abide by a contract which tells you, written by a bureaucrat, which tells you who washes the dishes, who takes the kids to school, etc., etc., etc. Okay? Okay, we would say this is totally absurd, correct? Totally insane. And we're talking of a contract which is very fundamental. Yet, if I want to buy insurance, that's the setup I have. But buying insurance is an adult trying to reduce their risk. And we say you can only do it if you buy insurance from someone which is in this registry. You're going to have to hire an insurance producer, which is a guy authorized by the state to teach you and protect you how you contract insurance, and then you have to abide by a contract written by the Superintendency of Insurance of what this insurance contract looks like. And I say, why? Why for marriage? We think that it's something that we have to decide freely, and of course, a lot of people may fail in this decision, correct? But if we want to do insurance, which is a contract to reduce risk, we think that we have to put all this regulation on top of it. It just doesn't make any sense to me, okay? So that's kind of just to to get us thinking, okay, on is it really, we need regulation on all these things? Okay. I think if you want to be consistent, then we should regulate marriage. I don't know. And there's a lot of regulation which is the result of business interest. For example, Argentina, you know, is a very wide country. It's 6 times the size of Spain with the same population. When Milei got to government, the provision of satellite internet was forbidden. Say, why was it forbidden? Well, because there was a local internet producer didn't want the competition from Starlink. Okay? So the regulation is not because someone was thinking, oh, it's good for Argentines not to have access to satellite internet. No, there was something that didn't want Argentines to have access to satellite internet. So Javier Milei, what he did in his 10th days as president, he eliminated that restriction. This is the number of Starlink clients in Argentina. In 2023, it was 0. Of course, there was no one. 2024 and 2025, 1 million people in Argentina today have access to internet through this. Government spending 0 pesos, just letting the market freely provide the services, okay? Now, let me just, because I have only 3 more minutes left, so let me just say that in order to generate I'm going to give you a couple of examples, but before that, before we pushed with the regulation agenda, we worked 2 years before Milei became president in a process where we reviewed all the laws of Argentina. I was a professor at the Universidad de San Andrés, so I sat with a team of 7 people and we started reading. And we classified the laws in laws that should be okay, that are okay, laws that should be repealed, and laws that should be changed. Okay, and I developed a methodology to do this. The result was what you're seeing here. The pile on the left was the pile of laws that had to be eliminated. The pile on the right was the pile of laws that had to be changed. And, well, that was the change you had to do, in my view. And I think in politics, the person who wins the debate is the person that puts the paper on the table. You know, says, oh, this is what has to be done, and this is the way you do it. And I wanted to make sure that the president of Argentina, when he got into office, had the papers on the table, could execute, could act upon them. And then these 2 piles of paper became 2 pieces of legislation was an executive decree that Milei launched his 10th days in government, which deregulated ample sectors of the economy. I'll give you a few examples in a minute. And then the second was a basis law that we discussed for 8 months in Congress and also implemented an additional number of deregulations. If you count the number of articles in the laws, in resolution, in dispositions, which eliminate things that people have to do, which the government was asking them to do, we're at the count of 10,000 deregulations, things that we have eliminated, okay? Let me give you a few examples. Well, this is one which is quite interesting, which is that in the previous law, we had some kind sort of like rent controls, alquileres, which is rentals. They were totally regulated. We basically deregulated completely the market. There was no time limits, there was no currency, there was no conditions. You could sublet, I mean, nothing. The law says absolutely nothing. It's a contract between two private parties. And the decree of Milei, you see there, DNU Milei, that's the decree. And the orange lines is the supply of apartments in the rental market. The real price of rentals fell 30%. And this was a tremendous success. Another example that I want to give you is that we basically allowed for very small airlines. You have a plane with 6 seats, or you have a plane with 12 seats, or you have a plane with 19 seats. Well, call me. I'll allow you to run an airline, and then you can start connecting cities. And now 1 million people in Argentina have access to a commercial flight in relatively middle small cities, which when Milei came to government didn't have access. So, and these are the connections that you see of, which are new connections in Argentina. Let me give you 2 more examples and then I'll finish. You know, Argentina has a beverage called yerba mate. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's like an energizing, like a substitute for Red Bull. Let me do a little bit of marketing for my country. Okay? And it's a very competitive industry, hundreds of producers, hundreds of brands, everything. So what does Argentina do when you have a competitive market? Well, you transform it into a monopoly, okay? This is the things the state do. This is what governments do. So they basically created an institute where all the producers could get together and then push the price up to twice the market price. And that's the way that we were drinking mate, which 96% of Argentinian families consume at twice the price. So Milei, in his executive decree, we eliminated the regulation on prices on yerba mate. The price of yerba mate fell 44%, so it's a very significant fall. But the most amazing thing which has happened is that the exports of yerba mate are at a record time. Because I told the yerba producers, your job is not to charge the Argentine consumer twice the price of yerba mate. Your job is to conquer the world, because if you have a product that you send to 96% of Argentinian families, why couldn't you sell it to 10%, 15% of families in the US, okay? So we had a kind of a click, a change in the chip. We're not gonna exploit our local consumers. We're going to go out and conquer the world, and that was also the result of deregulation. Let me give you one last example, which is a kind of our time's up. But can I do the last story? Okay, so this is kind of our, let's say, our story. You know, I basically open up my email and tell people, write to me and tell me how the state is making your life miserable, okay? And this is the way I say it in TV, okay? And then a guy writes to me and says, Federico, can you help me with my watermelons, okay? And I say, what's your problem with your watermelons? They don't taste good. No, they taste great. The problem with my watermelons is that I'm trying to export. In fact, I'm an exporter of watermelons. And the Food and Drug Agency tells me the way I have to export, I have to package the export of watermelons. And my problem is that my foreign client doesn't want that packaging. They want another packaging. So I tell the food and drug the agricultural guy, can I package the watermelons the way my client abroad wants the watermelon? And they said, no, because look here, there's a norm which says this is the way you have to, things of the military from the 1980s. So I've been kind of going over government offices, trying to convince them to allow me to package the watermelons. I said, Federico, this is not plutonium. This is not radioactive material, okay? This is just watermelons, okay? So anyway, so what do? I have no success. So what I do is I put the watermelons on the boat, and when the boat leaves the port, 100 meters, I say, stop, 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 and I send 60 guys, and they unpack, and then they repack, okay? And I was reading this on my computer, and I looked to my team, and I said, you know, guys, this has to be true. Because if I tried to imagine this story, I couldn't imagine it, okay? So it has to be true. So, and in fact, what was amazing is that when I started studying the thing, I realized it was the tip of the iceberg. And below, there was a tremendous amount of norms which weighted 1.5 kilos for fruit producers. So you had to get a PhD in literature before becoming a PhD of fruit producers to read all that shit, okay? And then, well, we basically reduced it to 80 grams of regulation. We eliminated all the restrictions. And, okay, the guy can, look at this.
Esta sandía es la primera sandía en la historia que se logra exportar al país vecino de Uruguay. Y queríamos darle las gracias exclusivas a nuestro presidente de la Nación, Javier Milei, a nuestro ministro de Deregulación, Federico Sturzenegger, porque sin ellos esto no hubiese sido posible. Específicamente, Federico logró disolver muchas trabas burocráticas que teníamos en aduana, y hoy un sueño que se transformó en realidad, hoy es un hecho concreto. Esperemos exportar muchos equipos más. Así que, Federico, querido, infinitamente gracias, y este video es para vos.
Okay, so small firms, big firms, this could not exist because of the intervention of the state. So that's why Javier Milei says, look, Maduro already used this. If not, your ministry should be called the Ministry of Happiness, okay? So anyway, so I hope I gave you a little bit of this video, by the way, was sent to me by this person last week, so I thought it would be fun to share it with you. But I say the agenda of the urgency of growth is the agenda of deregulation. That's what's going to generate growth. Sorry, stop. I'm finishing. It's the agenda of freedom. Embrace the ideas of freedom. Viva la libertad, carajo.